Heavenly Stories.
The sun dipped low over Eastbrook, painting the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts in hues of orange and pink. The small town, nestled in the Rust Belt of Ohio, had seen better days. Factories that once hummed with life now stood silent, their windows boarded up like closed eyes. In the heart of the neighborhood, the Eastbrook Community Center stood as a stubborn holdout against decay, a weathered brick building where kids played basketball, seniors shared stories, and families found a flicker of hope. But tonight, a shadow loomed larger than the setting sun. Grayson Enterprises, a corporate juggernaut, had its sights set on the land. David Carter, barely 22, stood outside the center, kicking a pebble across the parking lot. His worn sneakers scuffed the asphalt, and his oversized jacket hung loosely on his lean frame. With messy brown hair and eyes that carried a quiet determination, David didn't look like anyone's idea of a hero. He was just a local kid, raised in Eastbrook's toughest streets, who'd spent his childhood at the center, learning to read, shoot hoops, and dream of something better. Now, that refuge was at risk, and David felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. Word had spread like wildfire. Grayson Enterprises planned to demolish the community center to build luxury condos. The glossy flyers posted around town promised economic revitalization and modern living, but David saw through the jargon. The condos weren't for Eastbrook's people, families like his, scraping by on minimum wage. They were for outsiders, wealthy commuters who'd never set foot in the center's gym or attended its potluck dinners. The town council was holding a public meeting in a week, and Grayson's representative was coming to seal the deal. That representative was Victor Grayson, known in business circles as Goliath. At 6'5", with a commanding presence and a reputation for crushing opponents, Victor was the perfect weapon for his family's empire. He'd never lost a deal, whether in courtrooms or boardrooms, and his arrival in Eastbrook felt like a storm cloud rolling in. Whispers in the local diner painted him as untouchable, a man who could sway councils and silence protests with a single speech. To David, he was the giant standing between Eastbrook and its heart. David's mother, Ellen, joined him outside, her apron still dusted with flour from the center's kitchen. "You're brooding again," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "What's on your mind, kid?" He sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. "They're gonna tear this place down, Ma. The council's already half sold on Grayson's money. What chance do we have against someone like him?" Ellen's eyes, lined with years of worry, softened. "You've got more than you think, David. This place isn't just bricks, it's people. It's you, me, the kids, the volunteers. That's something no money can buy." David wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him. He wasn't a lawyer or a politician, just a part-time grocery clerk with a high school diploma and a knack for fixing things. Yet, the center had fixed him, giving him purpose when his father left and the world seemed too heavy. He couldn't let it go without a fight. That night, at the center's weekly meeting, the room buzzed with anxious voices. Neighbors packed the folding chairs, their faces a mix of anger and resignation. Maria, the center's director, stood at the front, her hands clasped tightly. "We've got 1 week before the council meeting," she said. "Grayson's sending their best to convince everyone this deal is good for Eastbrook. We need a plan." Ideas flew, petitions, protests, fundraisers, but each felt like a pebble against a mountain. David listened quietly, his mind racing. He thought of the old story his Sunday school teacher used to tell, about a shepherd boy who faced a giant with nothing but a sling and a stone. It sounded crazy, impossible even, but it stirred something in him. "I'll do it," David said, his voice cutting through the chatter. Heads turned, eyes wide with surprise. "I'll speak at the council meeting. I'll face Grayson." A murmur rippled through the room. Old Mr. Jenkins, who'd coached David's little league team, chuckled. "You're gonna take on Goliath himself? Kid, you got guts." Maria hesitated. "David, you're not trained for this. Victor Grayson's a shark. He'll eat you alive. Maybe, David said, standing straighter. But someone's gotta try. This place is worth it. As the meeting ended, David lingered, staring at the center's faded mural of kids playing under a bright sun. He didn't know how he'd face a man like Victor Grayson, but he knew why. The center was more than a building, it was home, hope, and proof that Eastbrook could still fight. Somewhere deep inside, a spark of faith told him that even the smallest stone could fell a giant, if aimed true. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the Eastbrook Community Center's basement, where David sat hunched over a rickety table, surrounded by a small crew of supporters. Papers littered the surface, petitions, old building permits, and a dog-eared notebook filled with David's scrawled ideas. The air smelled of stale coffee and determination. In 5 days, the town council meeting would decide the center's fate, and David had volunteered to face Victor Grayson, the corporate giant whose company threatened to erase Eastbrook's heart for profit. David rubbed his eyes, exhausted but wired. His mother, Ellen, poured him another cup of coffee, her brow furrowed. "You sure about this, David? You're not just fighting a man, you're fighting money, power, the whole system." "I know, Ma," he replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "But if we don't stand up now, we lose everything." He glanced at the others, Maria, the center's director, who'd seen countless kids like David find their way, Jamal, a high school senior who'd been mentoring younger kids at the center, and Mr. Jenkins, the grizzled ex-coach whose faith in David bordered on reckless. They were his unlikely army, armed with little more than hope. Maria slid a folder across the table. "I dug up some dirt on Grayson Enterprises. They've got a history of shady deals, cutting corners on safety, displacing low-income families. If you can expose that at the meeting, it might sway the council." David flipped through the pages, his heart sinking. The documents were dense, legal jargon swimming before his eyes. He wasn't a lawyer, he was a grocery clerk who fixed bikes on the side. How was he supposed to turn this into a weapon against someone like Victor Grayson? The man was a legend, a 6'5" titan who'd never lost a negotiation. Rumor had it he could charm a snake or intimidate a lion, depending on what the deal required. Jamal leaned forward, his basketball jersey wrinkled from a long day. "Yo, David, you gotta hit him where it hurts. Grayson's all about image. Call him out in front of everyone, make him look like the bad guy." "Easier said than done," David muttered. He pictured Victor's polished suits and razor-sharp smile, then looked down at his own faded jeans. The gap between them felt like a canyon. Mr. Jenkins clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "You don't need to be fancy, kid. You just need to be real. Speak from the heart. This town knows you. They don't know him." Over the next few days, David threw himself into preparation. He spent mornings at the library, poring over articles about Grayson Enterprises' past projects. He found stories of communities torn apart, promises of jobs that never materialized, and environmental violations swept under the rug. Each fact was a pebble, small but sharp, and David tucked them away, hoping they'd be enough. Afternoons were spent at the center, rallying volunteers to spread the word. They plastered flyers across Eastbrook, urging people to attend the council meeting. "Save our center," the posters screamed, with a photo of kids laughing in the gym. But doubt crept in at night, when David lay awake in his tiny bedroom, the walls thin enough to hear his neighbors' arguments. What if he froze under Victor's glare? What if the council didn't care? The community center wasn't just a building, it was where he'd learned to tie his shoes, where he'd cried after his dad left, where he'd found a family when his own fell apart. Losing it would be like losing a piece of himself. On the third day, David visited the center's old chapel, a quiet room with stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the floor. He wasn't much for praying, but something drew him there. Kneeling awkwardly, he whispered, "I don't know if I'm the right guy for this. But if you're listening, give me something, anything, to face this giant." As he stood, a memory surfaced, his Sunday school teacher, years ago, telling the story of a shepherd boy who faced a giant with nothing but a sling and 5 smooth stones. David had always thought it was just a tale, but now it felt like a mirror. He wasn't a warrior either, but maybe courage wasn't about size or strength. Maybe it was about showing up, even when you were scared. By the 4th day, Eastbrook was buzzing. The flyers had worked, people were talking, planning to pack the council meeting. But so was Grayson Enterprises. David overheard whispers at the diner about Victor's team offering incentives to council members, promises of campaign funds or fancy dinners. The giant wasn't just coming to fight, he was coming to conquer. That evening, David stood outside the center, watching kids play basketball under the flickering court lights. Jamal dribbled past, grinning. "You ready to sling some stones, man?" David managed a smile. "Yeah. Just gotta find the right one." Inside, he felt the weight of the town's hopes settling on his shoulders. Victor Grayson was a giant, no question. But David was starting to believe that even giants could fall, if you aimed true. The Eastbrook Community Center buzzed with a restless energy as the town council meeting drew closer, now just 2 days away. Inside the center's cramped office, David Carter sat surrounded by stacks of research, his laptop glowing with articles about Grayson Enterprises' shady dealings. His eyes burned from late nights, but his resolve was hardening like a stone in his pocket. The community was rallying, flyers blanketed the town, and neighbors were organizing carpools to pack the meeting, but so was the opposition. Victor Grayson's team had descended on Eastbrook, their sleek SUVs parked outside the diner, a silent reminder of the giant's reach. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His small team, Maria, Jamal, Ellen, and Mr. Jenkins, huddled around him, each offering ideas that felt like sparks in a storm. Maria, her glasses slipping down her nose, pointed to a printout. "This is gold, David. Grayson Enterprises got fined 3 years ago for dumping construction waste in a protected wetland. If you bring this up, it could make the council think twice." "Think twice?" Jamal scoffed, spinning a basketball on his finger. "Half the council's already in Grayson's pocket. I heard Councilman Reed got a consulting gig with them last week. Sounds like a bribe to me." David's stomach churned. He'd seen Reed at the center's last fundraiser, clapping kids on the back like he cared. The betrayal stung, but it wasn't surprising. Victor Grayson wasn't just a man, he was a machine, backed by money and influence that could bend wills like reeds in the wind. At 6'5", with a voice that could fill a courtroom, Victor had a reputation for dismantling opponents with a smile. David, with his second-hand jacket and no college degree, felt like a mouse staring down a lion. Ellen, his mother, set a plate of sandwiches on the table, her hand steady despite the worry in her eyes. "You don't need to out-talk him, David. You just need to out-heart him. Tell the council what this place means. Make them feel it." David nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. He wasn't a speaker. In high school, he'd stammered through a book report on To Kill a Mockingbird. How was he supposed to face a corporate titan who'd argued cases before federal judges? Still, the center's walls, covered in kids' drawings and faded photos of community events, reminded him why he couldn't back down. This was where he'd learned to fight, not with fists, but with hope. Outside, Eastbrook was coming alive. The community's efforts were paying off, local businesses donated food for a pre-meeting rally, and the high school band agreed to play. But Grayson's team was moving too. David spotted their glossy ads in the local paper, promising hundreds of jobs, and a new Eastbrook. The lies were polished, but they cut deep. Most of those jobs would go to outsiders, and the condos would price out locals like David's neighbors. That afternoon, David walked the neighborhood, knocking on doors with Jamal to drum up support. At Mrs. Lopez's house, the elderly woman pressed a rosary into his hands. "For luck, Mijo," she said. "You're fighting for all of us." Her words stuck with him, heavy but warm, like a stone smoothed by a river. Later, David found himself back in the center's chapel, the stained glass windows casting fractured light across the pews. He clutched the rosary, his thoughts a jumble. "I'm not a hero," he whispered. "I'm just a guy. But I can't let this place go. Help me find the right words." As he left the chapel, Maria caught him in the hall. "Bad news," she said, her face pale. "Grayson's team just filed a last-minute permit to fast-track the demolition. If the council approves it, we're done, no matter how many people show up." David's heart sank, but something in him snapped taut, like a sling pulled back. "Then we make sure they don't approve it," he said. "We've got 2 days. Let's use them." That night, the team worked late, refining David's speech. He practiced in front of a cracked mirror, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. He didn't have Victor's polish, but he had stories, of kids who'd found safety at the center, of seniors who'd found community, of families like his who'd found a home. Each story was a stone, small but solid, and David was learning to aim. By the next morning, Eastbrook was a powder keg. Grayson's team had plastered new signs, warning of economic decline, if the condos were blocked. But the community pushed back harder. Kids painted banners, and volunteers handed out buttons reading, "Save our center." David felt the town's pulse quickening, but he also felt Victor Grayson's shadow growing. The giant was coming, and David was running out of time to find his shot. The Eastbrook Community Center was a hive of activity, its worn floors creaking under the weight of purpose. With the town council meeting just 1 day away, David Carter stood in the gym, clutching a crumpled speech in his hands. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he rehearsed, his voice echoing off the walls where faded championship banners hung. At 22, with his messy hair and thrift store jacket, David looked more like a kid playing dress-up than a warrior facing a giant. But the giant, Victor, Goliath, Grayson, was coming, and David knew this was his last chance to save the center from Grayson Enterprises' wrecking ball. His team surrounded him, their faces a mix of encouragement and nerves. Maria, the center's director, adjusted her glasses, holding a clipboard of last-minute rally plans. Jamal, bouncing a basketball, nodded along to David's words. Ellen, David's mother, stood by the door, her apron swapped for a "Save Our Center" button. Mr. Jenkins, the old coach, leaned against the bleachers, his gruff voice cutting in. "Slow down, kid. Let the words breathe. You're not just talking, you're fighting." David nodded, but his heart raced. Victor Grayson wasn't just a corporate lawyer, he was a force of nature. At 6'5", with a voice that could silence a room, Victor had a track record of steamrolling opposition. David had seen his face on a glossy billboard that morning, promising a new Eastbrook with condos no local could afford. Worse, whispers swirled that Grayson's team had wined and dined half the council, securing votes with promises of jobs and kickbacks. The giant wasn't playing fair, but David hadn't expected him to. Outside, Eastbrook was alive with defiance. The community's efforts had snowballed, banners hung from lampposts, kids waved signs, and the local radio station aired interviews with center volunteers. But Grayson Enterprises fought back with slick ads and a press release claiming the center was a financial drain. David's stomach twisted at the lie. The center wasn't perfect, but it was a lifeline, where kids like Jamal stayed off the streets, where seniors like Mrs. Lopez found company, where David had found himself. That afternoon, David and Jamal hit the streets, passing out flyers. At the diner, they overheard a Grayson rep schmoozing a councilwoman, promising her a community fund that sounded more like a payoff. Jamal muttered, "They're buying this town, man." David clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of Mrs. Lopez's rosary in his pocket. He wasn't sure if he believed in miracles, but he needed one now. Back at the center, Maria pulled David aside. "I found something," she said, handing him a USB drive. "A whistleblower from Grayson's last project sent me emails. They prove Victor knew about the wetland violations but covered them up. If you use this right, it could expose him." David's pulse quickened. This was a stone, jagged and heavy. But wielding it meant facing Victor's wrath, and David knew the giant wouldn't hesitate to crush him with lawsuits or worse. He spent the evening refining his speech, weaving in the whistleblower's evidence. His words were raw, unpolished, but they carried the truth. The center was Eastbrook's soul, and Grayson's promises were poison. That night, David couldn't sleep. He slipped into the center's chapel, the stained glass windows dark but comforting. Kneeling, he whispered, "I'm scared. I'm not enough for this. But I can't let them down." The rosary felt warm in his hand, and a memory surfaced, his Sunday school teacher saying a shepherd boy's faith was stronger than a giant's armor. David didn't feel strong, but he felt something, a spark, stubborn and unyielding. By morning, Eastbrook was a battleground. Grayson's team flooded the town with last-minute flyers, warning of economic collapse without their project. But the community roared louder. The rally outside the center drew hundreds, families, kids, even the high school band blaring defiance. David watched from the sidelines, his speech folded in his pocket. Jamal slapped his back. "You got this, slingshot." As dusk fell, David stood alone in the gym, picturing Victor Grayson's towering frame and cold smile. The giant was close now, his shadow stretching over Eastbrook. David didn't know if his stones, his words, his truth, would be enough. But he knew he'd throw them with everything he had. The Eastbrook town hall was packed to the rafters, the air thick with anticipation and the hum of voices. Folding chairs lined the room, filled with townsfolk clutching "Save Our Center" buttons and homemade signs. The council sat at a long table on the stage, their faces unreadable under the harsh fluorescent lights. David Carter stood at a podium to the left, his hands gripping the edges, his heart pounding like a drum. Across from him loomed Victor "Goliath" Grayson, a 6'5" corporate lawyer whose tailored suit and steely gaze seemed to dwarf the room. The council meeting had become a battlefield, and David, in his worn jacket and scuffed sneakers, felt like a shepherd boy staring down a giant. The moderator, a nervous council aide named Ms. Harper, tapped the microphone. "We'll begin with opening statements. Mr. Grayson, you have the floor." Victor stepped forward, his presence commanding silence. His voice was smooth, confident, like a river carving through stone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Eastbrook stands at a crossroads. Grayson Enterprises offers progress, jobs, revenue, and modern housing that will elevate this town. The community center, while cherished, is a relic, bleeding funds this town can't spare. Our plan is the future. Let's embrace it." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others bristling. David felt a chill. Victor's words were slick, wrapping promises around a knife. He glanced at his team in the front row, Maria, Jamal, Ellen, and Mr. Jenkins, their eyes urging him on. In his pocket, he felt the weight of Mrs. Lopez's rosary and the USB drive with the whistleblower's evidence. These were his stones, but aiming them would take everything he had. Ms. Harper turned to him. "Mr. Carter, your opening statement." David swallowed, his throat dry. He stepped to the podium, his speech trembling in his hands. "I'm not a lawyer or a big shot," he began, his voice shaky but clear. "I'm just a kid from Eastbrook. This center raised me when my family was breaking. It's where Jamal learned to coach kids, where Mrs. Lopez finds friends, where we all find home. Grayson's condos won't help us, they'll push us out. This isn't progress. It's erasure." A ripple of applause broke out, giving David a spark of courage. He pressed on, telling stories of the center's impact, kids who stayed out of trouble, families who found support. Then he held up the USB drive. "Grayson Enterprises has a history of lies. They've broken laws, dumped waste, and displaced people like us. I have proof they hid violations on their last project. Do we trust them with our future?" The room erupted, some cheering, others gasping. Victor's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. When his turn came, he leaned into the microphone, his voice cutting like a blade. "Mr. Carter's passion is admirable, but his accusations are reckless. My company has created thousands of jobs nationwide. His proof is unverified slander from a disgruntled source. The center's a money pit. Last year, it ran a $50,000 deficit. Can Eastbrook afford that? David felt the crowd waver. Victor was good, too good, twisting truth into doubt. The council leaned forward, some nodding at Victor's numbers. David's mind raced. He wasn't a debater, but he knew Eastbrook's heart. That deficit kept kids fed, he shot back. It kept lights on for people who had nowhere else to go. What's the cost of losing that? Of losing us? The crowd roared, signs waving like battle flags. Victor countered, citing tax revenue and economic projections, each statistic a blow. David parried with stories, each one a stone slung from the heart. When he mentioned the wetland violations, Victor scoffed, demanding proof. David handed the USB drive to Ms. Harper, who promised to review it. The giant didn't flinch, but David saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of unease. As the debate closed, the council called for public comments. One by one, Eastbrook's people stood, Mrs. Lopez, her voice trembling, Jamal, fierce and proud, even shy kids who'd never spoken in public. Their words wove a tapestry of defiance, and David felt it, the town was with him. But Victor's shadow still loomed, his final smile promising the fight wasn't over. As the crowd spilled into the night, David stood with his team, exhausted but alive. He'd slung his stones, but the giant hadn't fallen, not yet. The council's vote was tomorrow, and David knew the real battle was just beginning. The Eastbrook town hall felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with hope and dread as the council prepared to vote. The room was still packed from the previous night's debate, with townsfolk spilling into the aisles, their "Save Our Center" buttons glinting under the lights. David Carter stood near the back, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, the rosary from Mrs. Lopez a quiet weight against his palm. His debate with Victor, Goliath, Grayson had left the town buzzing, but the giant hadn't fallen. At 6'5", Victor stood by the council table, his polished suit and calm demeanor a stark contrast to David's rumpled clothes and restless energy. The moderator, Ms. Harper, called for order, her voice strained. After reviewing all arguments and evidence, the council will now vote on Grayson Enterprises' proposal to redevelop the community center's land. David's heart thudded. He glanced at his team, Maria, Jamal, Ellen, and Mr. Jenkins, huddled nearby, their faces a mix of exhaustion and defiance. The debate had been brutal. David had slung his stones, stories of the center's impact, evidence of Grayson's shady past, but Victor had countered with cold numbers and promises of progress. The whistleblower's emails, now in the council's hands, were David's last hope, but he wasn't sure they'd be enough to topple a giant backed by money and influence. One by one, the council members spoke. Councilman Reed, rumored to be in Grayson's pocket, praised the condo project's economic benefits. David's stomach sank. Two more followed, echoing Victor's talking points about jobs and revenue. The crowd shifted, murmurs of frustration rising. But then Councilwoman Diaz, a longtime center volunteer, stood. "I've seen what that place does for our kids," she said. Mr. Carter's evidence raises serious concerns about Grayson Enterprises' integrity. "I vote to save the center." Cheers erupted, and David felt a spark of hope. Two more council members sided with Diaz, citing the whistleblower's emails, which detailed Grayson's environmental violations and cover-ups. The score was tied, and all eyes turned to the final voter, Mr. Patel, a quiet grocer who'd stayed neutral. He cleared his throat. "Eastbrook needs growth, but not at the cost of its soul. I vote to protect the community center." The room exploded. People hugged, kids waved signs, and Jamal pumped his fist. David stood frozen, hardly believing it. They'd won. The center was safe. Victor's smile faltered, his eyes cold as he shook hands with the council, already planning his next move. But for now, the giant had stumbled. Outside, the celebration spilled into the street. The high school band played, and neighbors shared food from the rally. Ellen pulled David into a hug, her eyes wet. "You did it, kid," she whispered. Maria clapped his shoulder, and Mr. Jenkins grinned. "Told you, slingshot. Aim true, and giants fall." But David knew it wasn't just him. It was Mrs. Lopez's prayers, Jamal's fire, Maria's research, and every neighbor who'd shown up. The center wasn't just a building, it was Eastbrook's heart, and they'd fought for it together. Victor approached, his towering frame casting a shadow. "Impressive, Carter," he said, his voice low. "But this isn't over. Enjoy your little victory." He walked away, his team trailing like an army retreating. David watched him go, feeling the weight of those words. Giants didn't stay down long. But as he looked at the crowd, kids laughing, seniors dancing, he felt something stronger than fear. The center would stand, and so would Eastbrook. Later, in the chapel, David knelt, the rosary warm in his hand. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure who he was thanking but feeling it deep in his bones. The fight had changed him. He wasn't just a grocery clerk anymore. He was a voice, a stone thrower, a defender of home. And as the sun rose over Eastbrook, painting the center's bricks in gold, David knew that no matter what giants came next, he'd be ready to sling again.